Hey, hope you're doing well. This is Edward. I want to show you a video today about doing more creative deals with a lot more seller financing and the criterias you need to kind of go for to be able to get to some of these deals. So there's quite a few buyers in the market that are potentially looking to not necessarily deal with a lot of the broker deals available, and they want to do more deals that involve a lot more seller financing than going to a bank and getting all that capital or potentially putting a lot of our capital down themselves. So I'm going to show you the kind of philosophy around it, what is involved, and how to go about it, what are the channels, and how you can start getting a lot more creative around this process. So first of all, what does it mean to have a lot more seller financing involved? So what it means is out of a total purchase price of a transaction, a bigger amount of that is going to be seller financing. So instead of having 5%, 10%, 20% seller financing, which is the typical broker deals, you will essentially have, let's say, more than 50, 60, 70, 80, even up to 90%, even up to 100% seller financing. So that's what it means. A lot of people want to get to that place just because they're kind of dealing with a seller directly and maybe a few investors and they don't want to go for a lot of stuff related to getting lending and going for that approval process. It takes a little bit longer, and then there's the broker and so forth and so forth. So a lot of people are afraid to go that route, or they're not able to go that route just because of their situation. Um, in order for you to do a deal like that, you need to realize a couple of key concepts. First of all, the first concept is the more local you are to the deal, the higher probability that you're going to be able to go and meet that person in real life, which means you're going to be able to build a better uh, connection with that person, better understand them. And that means you're going to be able uh, to potentially become an exception for them at deal structuring. Now, it's not always like that, but that's the first criteria is just pick a local deal, a deal close to you, because you're going to need to go and actually meet them if you're going to want to do more creative deals, more seller financing involved deals. The challenge with you doing this when you don't meet people in real life is that they're not looking you as an exception just because you didn't put enough work to become that exception yet. Now, if you're meeting them in real life, you're maybe traveling and seeing them and doing a lot of this effort, typically they're going to be more inclined to accept some of these things. So just keep that in mind. Now, more creative deals typically are deals that don't involve a particular advisory firm advising them of a sale process, or a brokerage firm, or a broker in general, or an intermediary that's selling that company. So if you, in theory, would just deal with a seller directly, what would happen is you'd have more immediate feedback from the seller. And if you have that trust factor built in over time, you've had a few real-time, real-life meetings with them, well, things can get a little bit more creative with that. Now, the reason also that doesn't work with brokers is because brokers, on the other hand, they want to protect their income. It's not only about protecting their deal, it's they just want to make as much money as possible per that transaction, which means if they get paid more on day one of the transaction, which is on the closing date, they get paid more on the commission side. Because if they're going to do a creative deal and accept it, one is they're not serving the seller, but they're also not serving themselves. And it's not very incentivized for them to accept some of these offers with a lot of seller financing. So just be able to understand some of these components. If you want to do a very creative deal, you're going to need to do a lot more stuff which involves around directly reaching out to sellers through a more of an off-market channel where you're going to be able to find sellers that don't deal with brokers. Essentially, they're trying to potentially consider selling their business themselves, whereas they are actually selling the business themselves without a broker, which is very rare typically in fairly big deals. We typically do deals in between $1 million in value up to $10 million in value, and You need to be very good at mastering how to do a lot of this off-market stuff to get in front of businesses at the right time with a right seller so that you can do a lot of these creative deals. And there's a system to that, and I'll talk a little bit about it, but that's kind of a second criteria, right? Is you need to go on the off-market channel to directly find a seller instead of talking to brokers. So if you go to a listing site, typically a lot of the listing sites have brokers that represent the sellers. Now, sometimes on listing sites, there's sellers directly selling businesses, and that's an exception, but you're going to need to go through a lot of deals to be able to find them. So just keep that in mind that sometimes that also works. You might say, hey, I'm never going to go into a lot of these listing sites because everybody's going to be a broker. Not necessarily. There's deals where the seller is selling the company. So just keep that in mind if you're going in biz buy sell or any of those other websites. You might find fairly big businesses that are sold by the seller. So in that case, if it's local to you, you're going to go and meet them. You're going to build a very tight relationship and you're going to really understand the business model. And the third criteria would be for you to be able to add a lot of value to the deal. Because the way you will actually build a relationship with a seller is by you portraying and you showing them tangibly how you can add value to that company. Either you have operational experience, if you either you have sales experience and you can drive sales in that company, either you have marketing experience, you can drive marketing and you can drive a revenue of that company, either you have financial engineering experience and you can do something in the company where you can add value to reducing costs, improving some channel, whatever you're doing. If you don't see yourself how you're going to be able to add value, even if you're going to have a lot of these face-to-face conversations with the owner, yes, they may like you, they may trust you a little bit more, but if they don't see how you're going to add tangible enterprise value to the deal, they're not really going to do more creative stuff with you in most cases. So just keep that in mind. The third criteria is being able to portray how you're going to be able to add operational value to some of these deals. And that means you're going to need to create a plan. That means you're going to need to look into yourself and to your background, who you are, and how you're going to be able to add value to some of these companies. Because if you can't add value, you're not really the most ideal buyer for them. They're typically going to pass on you. And then some of these people that are looking for some of these creative deals, they don't want to be involved with a lender, which means they don't want to go for the approval process. They don't want to go for the SBA process or commercial loan process or whatever process to getting a loan approved and getting a loan to be able to buy this business. There's different reasons for that. Some people have lower personal credit. Some people have issues with some income right now, or some people have other issues. They just don't want to deal with logistics of getting the loan. So they prefer to just fully commit themselves to finding a seller and do a deal locally that way, and they just want to focus on that. So it depends on you, right? But this is another reason why people get into this. Now, if you don't want to deal with, again, a lender, that also implies you're going to need to find a different source of capital. And the reason is there's very few deals that actually have just 100% seller finance, and that's really the truth. Because if it were that easy to find an off-market deal at 100% seller finance, everybody would do it every day, and nobody would need any investors. Nobody would need any operational experience. Nobody would even need to understand how to source some of these deals, and then you would see a lot more people in the market doing 100% seller finance deals without any involvement of any of these parties. But in reality, if you don't have as much liquidity and you don't have understanding how to do this, you're not really going to be able to pull this off. So it implies that if you don't have as much liquidity, you're going to need to go and source some of this capital from a person or an accredited investor or an investor essentially in your market. It doesn't matter where you're based in. Uh, if you're in the US or in Canada or a different market, it doesn't really matter. You're still going to need to source some of these people to essentially use that as leverage to start negotiating with a seller and just to put a deposit down to show them that you're a lot more serious. Yes, we've done. deals where we've done 100% seller financing in the past, but that is very rare and that's very particular to the scenario. And we've done deals like that on profitable a million EBITDA deals, but it doesn't always happen on that. So you having that expectation is not really going to yield you results. What you need to realize is what's a fairly common structure based on what we see, closing more than 40 deals like that in the past, is somebody would come in and put maybe 10% down, 20% down, 30% down, maybe even 40% down. And then they would do the rest of seller financing, such as if they put down 10%, they'll pay 90% seller financing. They put down 20%, they'll do 80%. If they'll pay 30%, they'll do 70% seller financing, which is a little bit more appropriate for some of these businesses. Now, that also implies you have a lot of operational experience where you can add value to the business. That also involves that you've took some of these meetings in real life with the seller and they trust you. They feel that you are the right buyer with these businesses. And that also implies that you understand or you have some of this capital set aside or you understand how to source some of this capital from investors. Now, if you're going to source this capital from investors, let's say you don't have any liquidity set aside, you have maybe $20,000, but you need half a million. Where if you're going to go and get 480 from somebody else, you're going to need to exactly know how that works. So that's another skill set. Not only you need to understand how to add value to the company, you need to understand how to source these deals, and you need to understand how to source some of this capital, because in most cases, as I said, you're not going to be able to come in and just do 100% seller finances in most cases, right? So that also implies you will need to have a process, a clear process of finding your credited people, presenting them the deal, and actually partnering up with them, not you owning the whole business yourself. You're going to need to actually, in most cases, share ownership with some of these investors. So if they're going to own the company with you, right? You need to understand what preferred shares are. You need to understand what step up is. You need to understand how to properly pitch a deal. You need to understand what are the typical concerns they have. You need to understand that in some cases, if you don't have any leverage over that investor and he has a lot more leverage, he might add more operational value than you, then he might own majority in that company and you might own minority. But at the same time, even if that happens, you're still getting your foot in the door in an off-market deal in a fairly good business, assuming you've done proper due diligence. And now you own, let's say, even 20, 30% of that company without no investment and without necessarily having the best credit possible, let's say. So in that case, you went in the market, you found a deal, you've put in the work, you can add value to the deal, you found an investor, and now you've done a more creative deal without a bank, without a broker, more creatively through that channel. So that's how this works. Hopefully this makes more sense, but these are kind of the sorts of criterias you need to be able to do a deal like this. Let me know if that helps, and that's pretty much it. Thank you.